But I do want to talk about why I think it's so important that we continue to listen to, like, who are the people who are most vocally opposed to the tariffs. And I'm not talking about, like, if you talk to, like, people that are doing interviews with people on the streets, like, that's important. Like, we need to hear how this is going to affect the every person kind of narrative. That's fucking important. But let's also be careful when Larry Fink of BlackRock is complaining, because it makes me then, like, does he have our best interests in mind? Does he have, you know, the average person on the streets' best interests in mind? Never. Never. So I don't want to just completely discredit what he says and commit, like, that logical fallacy that's like nothing he says could be valid whatsoever. But I do think it's important for us to at least have our radars up, you know? Who are the people who are most scared of it? And then what I think is important to do is then come up to our, like, buddies who are, people who actually care about average people, um, you know, and say, hey, like, I know that there's a lot of fear and panic out there, but let's figure out if we can be a little bit more precise in how we think about this. Like, yes, it's going to impact us. It's going to have a serious, measurable impact. It's going to cause more divisions socially, culturally, economically. It's going to fucking hurt. But let's not buy the lie, and this is what I'm concerned with, I think, ultimately. Let's not buy the lie that somehow those old, like, baton holders of the neoliberal order, or that are, like, bemoaning the fall of multilateralism and the liberal order, let's not, like, somehow fall into the idea that they're our saviors in this. I think that's the ultimate crux of this, because they're not. They're not like the good guys. This isn't like good versus bad here. They're kind of like all bad, you know? And I think we need to start thinking, like, genuinely seriously about, like, what could alternatives be. And the only way that we could do that, the only way we could even, like, believe in such a world is, one, if we have a proper diagnosis of how things actually are. And two, if we can cut through the fucking spin that's fed to us by these people who are trying to get our allegiance. And I think that it's actually highly manipulative that these fucking liberal political commentators who are bemoaning Trump's tariffs are acting like they're the fucking saviors, like they actually care about people. They don't really care about people. They care about preserving the liberal order. They care about preserving the way things used to be, right? So both are wrong. Both are bad. Both are people that I don't think we should, like, give our fidelity to, or our allegiance to. Listen to them, understand what they're saying, but cut through the fucking noise. So check out these two articles. This one, Authoritarian Neoliberalism and the Myth of the Free Market, and by Ian Brough. Check this out. Give it a read. And he will talk about, like, why it is that authoritarian neoliberalism, that authoritarianism, that nationalist and economic protectionist measures are not necessarily opposed to the larger project of neoliberalism, because neoliberalism has never been about free markets. It's always been about ensuring the private wealth of large firms and corporate players on the market. So check this out. I think that's an interesting one to read. And then I'm just going to read a little section from my article that I wrote years ago about what I think is actually coming. There's been some pushback. I know Michael, actually, I think on Wisecrack, did we do a video? I think we did, on like neo-feudalism, or like the feudal economy that's coming. But this is what I think is important for us to think about. Okay. So I mentioned this book earlier by Elizabeth Humphreys right here, about her book that was called How Labor Built Neoliberalism. And I use an argument from her book in this little essay to kind of try to show, like, how it is that the left was complicit, the quote left, right, the centered left, was complicit in constructing neoliberalism, because essentially it was this. Negotiations took place in Australia on what are called the Australian Labor Accords, where workers essentially agreed that they wouldn't continue to strike in exchange for particular offsets, those offsets being, like, superannuation, which is their retirement scheme here, which is really great, and also like other concessions that they would be able to get in the labor market, right? Expanded healthcare, superannuation, other workplace protections that are all like beneficial things that workers would want to fight for. So under the Accords, what happened is the government agreed, workers agreed that they would no longer like strike, and the unions would no longer continue to let their antagonism burst out and disrupt the economy, keep things moving as going. Now, the problem with that is what has happened is that things like superannuation have been financialized. And so these mechanisms that were built, the healthcare system is now highly financialized. Even if it is funded largely by the government, there are still mechanisms that highly leverage the healthcare system in Australia, but also in the UK, entirely in the United States, are leveraged by financial operators that are siphoning off of, that are leeching off of, if you will, the underlying economic infrastructure, including the economic resources that are funded by the government in those countries, right? So my concern is that, okay, and this is what I said. So like what this genealogy instructs, looking at the labor accords, is that there's a complex relation between democracy and capitalism, and that it's fraught through and through. In the struggle between social concerns and economic vitality, the concessions we make have effects that outstretch popular political rationality. And this was all in the context of when Bernie Sanders was on board and trying to talk about universal health care. And my worry was, hey, guys, let's not think that by implementing universal health care within this larger global economic regime, that's somehow going to actually like, that's going to be that's going to be like a panacea, like a cure-all. Because there's possibility that, and this is what I talk about here, there's possibilities that, just like with the Australian Accords, where the healthcare system and superannuation have been highly financialized, that most likely that's what would happen with any sort of implementation of universal healthcare in the United States, right? That was the kind of overall argument that I was making. So then I talk about this, and this is the reason why, because these are the monsters that are facing us. So I say, in order to best prepare, we must understand our context. The monstrosity of neoliberalism consumes the majority of critical political discourse today, but there's a two-headed dragon emerging from the socioeconomic seas that we need to include in the bevy of concerns comprising neoliberal critiques. On the one side, we have the emergence of what some are calling the new feudalism, and on other, the asset economy. So in a 2016 article entitled "Welcome to the New Feudalism, with Silicon Valley as Our Overlords," Evgeny Maratsov describes the steady march of Google and Facebook towards feudal ownership over greater proportions of the economy. This is 2016, right? Now we're fucking almost 10 years later. How much more is this true? Maratsov writes, by destroying all competition and making the world dependent on their platforms, these neo-feudal lords will increase their control over how economic resources are accessed, right? This is the rise of what we might call like the platform economy. Platforms are now dominating everything, right? Even GE, these old industrial era companies are now like platformatized. And so one of the things I talk about is like one such result could be the institution of micropayments for everything from time spent web surfing to any and all social media activities. Isabella Kaminsky for Financial Times calls these new platforms like mini command economies, and that the expansion of these platform economies is producing a situation in which the force that pulls inwards of these and other platforms is creating the leverage relations by which any social democratic concessions will take place. In other words, the leverage relations are who has leverage to make the decisions. Increasingly, it's these platforms, right? And the people who run these platforms and the people who finance these platforms, like fucking Larry Fink from BlackRock, the guy who's now complaining that the neoliberal global order is diminishing. Of course he's upset, because he would be investing in these fucking firms. The soft banks of the world, these massive financial institutions. Of course they're upset. It's going to hit them in their pocketbooks. They don't want that. In a similarly themed article, Joshua A.T. Fairfield warns of a return to the Middle Ages. So this goes back to, who was it? Who was saying it in the comments of like going back to the robber baron era, right? It's going back to the Middle Ages. The threat that Fairfield talks about is not restricted to the platforms of Google and Facebook. The Internet of Things is something that is perpetually happening. It interconnects the most seemingly benign of household devices to centralized information processing centers. Our fish tanks can be used by hackers to breach our data. Roombas map our homes. Fitbits manage our bodies. Even the central computers on our cars provide a steady flow of information to mini command economies. Increasingly so as electric cars with no autonomous motors gain market share. They can tell how much you fucking weigh in your electric cars now. Have you heard about this? Electric cars can now tell if you're gaining weight and losing weight, which means that they can then sell that data to like some marketer that's going to like market to you to be like, hey, you want to fucking buy our weight loss system? You know, like that's how much we can be monitored now by these central command economies. All right, so that's the neo-feudal economy that is kind of facing us. This leads to the second head of the dragon that is confronting us. And this is where I did a lot of my research here in Sydney. It's on something that's called the asset economy. So I write, beyond the discomfort that comes from privacy being a value of yesteryear, as a deeper ingrained causal mechanism that reveals the potential for disadvantages facing what I called the Trojan horse socialist strategy, which is like, if we get universal health care, then we could be able to sneak in like ownership over the means of production kind of thing. And I think a lot of lefties during the Bernie heyday back in like 16, 20, what was it, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, whatever. I think they kind of thought that like, we can start. Bhaskar Sankara at Jacobin wrote something about that. And a bunch of people online were talking about like, we get universal healthcare and then like ownership over the means of production kind of thing. And I was like, guys, hold on. You get universal healthcare. It's not necessarily going to be like this Trojan horse where all of a sudden you're going to be able to like surprise them with your socialism, democratic socialism on the other side. And partly it's because of neo-feudalism, but also of what's called the asset economy. So I'll keep reading. After the recent news of Apple's reinvention as a services company, digital economist and author of Platform Capitalism, Nick Cernick, tersely explained this novel phenomenon. Capitalism on its way to ending private property for the masses and having everything provided as a service by quasi-monopolistic firms. Important to note, he doesn't say like it's no longer capitalism, right? This still fits squarely within the logic of capitalism, which makes us maybe have to rethink like what is capitalism? If it's not about like free markets and free trade, and then what the fuck is this thing called capitalism, right? I think it's really important for us to think about. And I think I have some thoughts on this. As a matter of fact, I have a forthcoming book where I kind of like theorize a whole new way for us how we can understand what capitalism is, and maybe we can talk about it at some point. But this idea that ends private property for the masses and has everything provided as a service by a quasi-monopolistic firm or a full-on monopolistic firm. And I say, welcome to the neo-feudal asset economy. This is a world in which many command economies own the platforms that dictate the limits and the demands of socioeconomic life, and then provide the only conditions, the only opportunities, the only outlets for how this life can be lived. So they own everything, and we lease. They own it. We have to pay for it to be able to survive. So increasingly, the focus on such neo-feudal capital enterprises is shifting from a simple commodity production to asset ownership and management. As landscapes are recomposed into assets controlled by infoscapes, relations of leverage are being reconstituted around new arrangements within the asset economy. What I'm saying here is essentially that like landscapes are no longer like, just think of a field, a beautiful fucking field with some trees and stuff like that. Well, that's now like a financialized real estate asset. Someone comes along, they say, yeah, that's worth X amount of money. I'm going to put that into my bank portfolio, and I'm going to sell my bank portfolio with that as a kind of like piece of an asset in my diversified portfolio onto like other players in the market, right? And then now increasingly it's turning into an infoscape. And not only that, but I'm going to fucking put a bunch of sensors and security cameras, and I'm going to monitor everything that I can in this field to get as much data and information as I can from it and digitize everything as well. And what that does is that reconstitutes these relations of leverage. In other words, it changes like who has the fucking power and where that power sits and how that power can be wielded, right? So Fairfield then notes how these mini command economies become the owners of even the devices that we think we own. Our smartphones, for example, are just fancy electronic boxes packaged with sensitive proprietary software inside that is owned and controlled by a mini command economy that can do with it what it fucking wants. And yeah, of course, there's some regulation about some privacy stuff, yada, yada, yada. Come on. We know that that's just like paying lip service so that people don't fucking revolt. Really, the people who are kind of controlling the laws and commanding how it is that these devices are able to siphon data from us, it's controlled by the private sector in cahoots with the government, right? I mean, is there any wonder why at Trump's inauguration, it was like all the fucking tech billionaires in the world were there, like being all happy and shit? Because they know, like, they're going to continue to gain more power in the market. In other words, they get to own everything. We have to lease it, right? I don't want to keep reading, but I think this is. Oh, here we got some chats here. Rick Evans said, "I've heard it described as techno-feudalism." Yeah, that's Yanis Varoufakis, who has written that book, Techno-Feudalism, which is, I think, just came out last year, maybe the year before, and he's been talking about that for a couple years now. I mean, I'd like to think I was before the game talking about the neo-feudalism, but yeah, techno-feudalism, absolutely. That's absolutely a way I think that we can think about it. The question is this, again, going back to everything. Is what Trump doing somehow actually changing the neoliberal global economic order? And my argument would be that no, it's not. It's just going to reconstitute neoliberalism, or it's going to reconstitute global capitalism under some different conditions, right? Where what he's trying to do is he's trying to kind of like get the United States to supposedly be in a stronger position, maybe devalue the dollar, maybe bring some exporting back to the United States, exporting capacities back to the United States. The problem is that's going to take fucking decades for factories and for manufacturing to come here. There's also no guarantee that money is going to want to invest here. Last thing I'll say is, like, going back to what I talked about earlier, is these Volcker shocks. Remember, I was talking about these Volcker shocks that interest rates went really fucking high and changed the economy. One of the fallouts of that was that manufacturing left to build overseas because to borrow money was really expensive. So if interest rates are 15% rather than 3%, and you have money, you got capital, and you want to borrow money, but you got to borrow money at 15% interest rate, you're not going to want to build a factory because building a factory is really fucking expensive. So you got to borrow a lot of money to build a factory here, but interest rates are really high. So what you would rather do is be like, well, I'm going to go to a place where I can spend my $70 million and I can get a lot of bang for my buck in some other country. Simultaneously, what you might do is you might be like, but wait a second. Interest rates are 15%. That means I could become a debt lender. I can become a financier. I can figure out a way to not build physical fixed capital like manufacturing plants and industry plants and things like that in America. But what I could do is I could put my money in a bank, or I could partner with a financial institution, or I could figure out a way to turn my company into a financial institution, like something like GE has done, right? And the reason you would do that is because then you're getting 15% return on the money that you're investing into the economy. So this has led to the financialization of the economy, right? So to try to reverse all of this and then re-onshore manufacturing means that you've got to figure out a way to incentivize those people who previously wanted to start factories and shit overseas to get them to do it here. Hence the tariffs, right? But there's a bunch of other factors that need to be considered. The high cost of labor. Americans get paid a shitload more money because living standards are higher. Purchasing power is higher. So we're going to have to figure out ways. They would have to figure out ways to make it worthwhile to bring the manufacturing plants back to the United States rather than continuing to benefit from the cheap labor abroad. So this is why I don't think that what Trump is actually doing is actually shaking up the neoliberal economic order so much as creating an opportunity for some sort of new alignment that won't be figured out in the short term, right? Some sort of new alignment within what we might call authoritarian neoliberalism that isn't going to ultimately fundamentally change the system. And it's definitely not going to fundamentally change the system in some sort of equitable way.